Judge tried to expose the girl with a rare language. She answered instantly. The judge did not look up when she was brought in. He was reading something or pretending to, and the performance of not looking was itself a statement. It said, "You are not worth the adjustment of my attention." It said, "Whatever you are, I have already decided." It said, in the precise silent language of institutional power, that the woman now standing before his bench in an orange jumpsuit was an item to be processed, and processing did not require eye contact. Her name was Mara Venn. She was 24 years old. She stood with her arms crossed, not defensively, but with the particular containment of someone who has decided that the space her body occupies is her own, and she intends to hold it. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, and her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure is a form of resistance rather than comfort. She looked at the judge with a directness that was not hostile and not performing confidence. It was simply honest. She was looking at the man who was about to make a decision about her life, and she was looking at him the way you look at something you have already studied thoroughly and are now seeing in person for the first time. She had been studying him since 3 days after her arrest, when Sylvia Park had told her in their first substantive conversation everything she needed to know about Raymond Coyle's courtroom style. Sylvia had described the theatre, the performed authority, the prepared questions designed to diminish. She had described the gallery of attorneys who had stood where Mara now stood and had understood too late that the ground beneath them was not flat. Mara had listened carefully as she listened to everything, and she had thought about it the way she thought about phonology, not as performance to be countered with performance, but as a structure to be understood. If you understood the structure, you could stand inside it without being shaped by it. If you understood the rules, you were not ruled by them in the same way. She had not planned a response to whatever the judge would try. She had simply been herself, completely, and waited to see what the room required. The courtroom was full. This was unusual for a preliminary hearing, but the case had attracted attention in the way that certain cases attract attention before anyone can fully explain why. Something about it had the texture of a story that people sensed was larger than its surface. The charge was serious. Possession with intent to distribute based on materials found in a storage unit registered in Mara's name. The prosecution's case was, on paper, tight. The defense's case was, on paper, thin. And yet the gallery was full of people in suits who had rearranged their Thursday mornings to be here, and the court reporter was already seated with an alertness that suggested she had been told to pay close attention. And the two attorneys at the prosecution table were talking in low, careful voices, with the focused energy of people managing something they were not entirely sure they have fully under control. Judge Raymond Coyle was 57 years old and had served on this court for 14 years. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that requires no particular effort to project. It simply exists in a room and arranges itself accordingly. He had a reputation among the attorneys who practiced in his courtroom for a specific kind of intelligence. The intelligence of a man who reads situations quickly and applies pressure at the point of maximum effect. He was not known for cruelty exactly, but he was known for what some of his colleagues privately called theatre. He understood that the courtroom was a stage and that the judge was its director. And he exercised this understanding with a consistency that crossed the line, sometimes, from judicial authority into something that resembled performance for its own sake. He had been briefed on Mara Venn the way he was briefed on most defendants, through a summary prepared by the prosecution. The summary described her background with the efficient compression of a document designed to establish relevant facts and nothing else. 24. No prior convictions. Employed part-time at a university research library while pursuing a graduate degree in comparative linguistics. The storage unit had been registered in her name 18 months ago. The materials found inside it had a street value assessed by the prosecution's expert at approximately $240,000. What the summary did not include, because it was not the prosecution's job to include it and no one else in the chain had thought to add it, was anything about who Mara Venn actually was in the full and specific sense of the phrase. The summary was a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional person, and it was a projection chosen to illuminate one particular angle, and Judge Raymond Coyle had read it and formed his shape the way he always formed his shapes. Quickly, confidently, and with very little appetite for revision. He had looked up Ubik himself the previous evening, not from curiosity, but from tactical preparation. He had found it described in a linguistics encyclopedia entry as possessing 84 distinct consonant phonemes, more than any other documented language, a sound inventory so complex that even professional phoneticians required extended, dedicated study to achieve anything resembling production accuracy. The entry had noted that the last native speaker had died in 1992 and that documented recordings existed in academic archives. He had read this and thought, perfect. He had thought it the way a person thinks it when they have found exactly the lever they were looking for. A graduate student in comparative linguistics. Excellent. Put her in front of a room full of people and ask her to produce the language she claims as her expertise. Watch the expertise dissolve. Watch the room understand who they are dealing with. He had not considered the possibility that she actually knew it. The thought had not formed. It was too far outside the shape he had already made. He looked up. He looked up and he found her looking directly at him, which was not the response he usually received from defendants at this stage of a proceeding. Most defendants looked away or down or at their attorney or at the floor with the focused intensity of someone trying to disappear into the carpet. The ones who looked back at him usually did so with something he could read: fear, defiance, calculated performance. He could not read Mara Venn's expression, and the inability to read it was itself interesting in a way that he chose, in the moment, to treat as a provocation rather than a signal. He set down his papers. "Ms. Venn," he said, and his voice filled the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been filling rooms with his voice for a very long time. "You are currently enrolled as a graduate student in comparative linguistics. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And your area of focus?" Mara paused for one small beat. Not hesitation. The pause of someone choosing the most accurate answer from several available options. Endangered and extinct language documentation, with a secondary focus on phonological reconstruction. Several people in the gallery shifted slightly. The court reporter's fingers moved. Coyle smiled. It was the smile of a man who has just found the angle he was looking for. Those who knew his courtroom recognized it. Those who did not would understand it in approximately 30 seconds. "Fascinating," he said, in a tone that made the word mean its opposite. He looked down at something on his bench, a single page that he had placed there before the hearing, and the placement of it there, prepared in advance, was the tell that what followed was not spontaneous. "Then perhaps you can help the court. I've always been curious about the Ubik language, spoken by a people of the Caucasus region, virtually extinct since the last known native speaker died in 1992. He looked up at her. "Could you say something in Ubik for the court, Ms. Venn, since you're the expert?" The room absorbed the request in silence. It was, as nearly everyone in that room understood immediately, a trap, not a legal trap, a social one. Ubik was not merely an obscure language. It was one of the most phonologically complex languages ever documented, possessing more distinct consonant sounds than almost any other known language, a sound system so intricate that it had defeated even dedicated linguists, so unusual that its phonology had been described in academic literature as requiring years of specialized study to approximate even passably. Coyle was not asking Mara to demonstrate expertise. He was asking her to demonstrate its absence. He was expecting her to stand there in her orange jumpsuit and stumble and fall silent and be exposed in front of a full gallery as a student who had claimed a field she could not inhabit. It was designed to humiliate, to reduce, to re-establish in the precise and public vocabulary of the courtroom the hierarchy that her steady gaze and crossed arms had momentarily unsettled. He waited. Mara looked at him for a moment, just a moment. Something moved through her expression that was difficult to name. Not quite amusement and not quite sadness, but something that contained elements of both. Then she uncrossed her arms and stood very straight and opened her mouth. What came out was Ubik, not approximate Ubik, not the phonetically simplified rendering of someone who had read about the language in a survey text. What came out was Ubik spoken with the layered, stacked consonantal complexity that defines the language. Sounds that do not exist in English or in most of the world's languages, produced with the specific placement and airflow of a person who had spent years training their vocal apparatus to make them. She spoke 4 sentences. They were measured and deliberate and completely without performance. Delivered in the unhurried manner of someone speaking a language they know, rather than displaying a language they have rehearsed. The content of what she said was not incidental. She had chosen the sentences the way you choose evidence, for their precision and their appropriateness to the situation. The first was a simple declarative sentence she had used in her fieldwork introductions, a greeting that established the speaker's purpose. The second was a compound structure that demonstrated the language's capacity for encoding complex relational information in a single construction. The third was a sentence from an oral narrative recorded by her principal informant in Turkey, preserved in the archive she'd been building for 2 years, spoken now in a courtroom in a country that had never heard it. The fourth was her own composition. A statement of fact about the day, the room, and the person standing in it, expressed in a language that had almost ceased to exist and that she had spent 2 summers working to ensure would not. None of the people in the courtroom could verify the content. That was not the point. The point was that the sounds were real. The structure was real. The certainty with which she produced them was real. And every person in that room who had ears and attention could hear the difference between the language of someone who has studied a subject and the language of someone who inhabits it. The room did not respond immediately. The response, when it came, was the particular sound of a large number of people exhaling at the same moment, which in aggregate sounds like nothing so much as a held breath released. Judge Coyle stared at her. He had prepared the question with the certainty of a man who knew what the answer would be. He had not prepared for this answer. He had no container for it, no procedural category, no authoritative response. He sat behind his bench with the specific expression of a man holding something that has turned out to be heavier than expected and trying to decide where to set it down without losing his posture. Mara looked at him and waited. Her arms were at her sides now. She looked, if anything, slightly more patient than she had before. "Your Honor," said her attorney, a woman named Sylvia Park, who had been watching from the defense table with the controlled focus of someone who had prepared for precisely this moment and was now watching the preparation become real. "My client's research specialty includes field documentation of Ubik phonology conducted during 2 summers of fieldwork in Turkey, where the remaining diaspora community of Ubik descendants maintains partial linguistic memory of the language. She has also co-authored a paper on consonantal reconstruction in extinct Caucasian languages that was published in a peer-reviewed journal of phonological studies last spring." She let that settle. Then she opened the folder in front of her and said, "We also have some additional documentation we would like to submit that we believe is directly material to the evidentiary questions before this court." Coyle looked from Mara to Sylvia and back to Mara. He had 14 years of judicial experience. And 14 years of judicial experience is, among other things, an extended education in how to recover composure in public. He recovered it. Not entirely, and not as fast as usual, but he recovered it. "We'll hear the documentation," he said. He said it without theatre. For the first time since the hearing began, he said something without theatre, and in the absence of the theatre, the room felt different, slightly larger, slightly more honest, slightly more like the place it was supposed to be. The documentation was a 41-page package that Sylvia Park had assembled over the preceding 3 weeks with the focused, methodical energy of someone who had understood from the beginning that this case was not what it appeared to be and had proceeded accordingly. It began with Mara's academic record, which was the kind of record that institutions frame and hang on walls. It continued with letters from 3 faculty members at the university, letters that used words like exceptional and rigorous, and the kind of intellectual seriousness that is genuinely rare rather than merely asserted. It included the published paper on ubique phonology, with the journal's acceptance letter and the peer review notes still attached. It included documentation of the 2 fieldwork summers in Turkey, with corresponding university approvals and the names of the Turkish linguistic institutions that had hosted the research. The paper on ubique phonology was the document that Coyle would read most carefully. It was 18 pages long and densely technical, the kind of text that uses notation systems unfamiliar to most readers and assumes a baseline of linguistic training that the average person does not possess. But even without the ability to evaluate its technical claims, the document communicated something that required no specialist knowledge to receive. It had been written by someone who had spent years inside a subject and had produced from that immersion something precise and accountable and publicly verified by the standards of the most rigorous institutional review available in that field. The 2 peer reviewers, whose comments were included in the package, had pushed back hard on specific methodological choices and had asked for revisions that demonstrated mastery of the underlying literature. Mara had addressed every point with the kind of thorough, specific engagement that reviewers describe. When they find it as exactly right, the paper had been accepted on its 2nd submission. None of this was the criminal case. None of it bore directly on the storage unit or the materials inside it, but it bore directly on the person who was supposed to have put those materials there, and the person the package described was not compatible in any coherent way with the narrative the prosecution had assembled, not because scholars cannot commit crimes, but because the specific crime alleged had required the use of a stolen identity document on a specific date in a specific way, and the person described in the package was a person who had, on that same date, been in the company of a faculty supervisor at a research meeting documented in the university's administrative calendar, a meeting whose minutes had been included, quietly and without fanfare, on page 39 of the package, attached to a copy of the calendar entry bearing Mara's name and the supervisor's digital signature. And then it included something else entirely, something that the first 38 pages had been building toward without announcing it, something that changed the shape of the storage unit and everything that had been found inside it in a way that the prosecution's summary had not anticipated, because the prosecution's summary had been assembled from what was available without asking what might be missing. The storage unit was not Mara's, not in any meaningful sense. It had been registered in her name 18 months ago using identification documents she had reported stolen 19 months ago. The theft report was in the package, a police incident report filed and stamped, dated 1 month before the registration of the storage unit. The name on the storage unit's registration matched the name on the stolen ID. The signature on the registration form, which Sylvia had obtained through a subpoena processed 4 days earlier, did not match Mara's signature on any of 17 documents that the package included for comparison. A forensic document examiner retained by the defense had analyzed both and produced a 2-page report concluding with the professional opinion that the signature on the registration form had not been produced by the same person who had signed the comparison documents. The package closed with a single page that identified, by name and prior address and current warrant status in another jurisdiction, the individual who had been Mara's roommate at the time the ID was stolen and who had, in the months following, accumulated 2 additional fraud-related charges in a city 400 miles away, before disappearing from the address listed in that city's records approximately 6 weeks before Mara's arrest. Sylvia set the package on the table and looked at Coyle. She did not say anything further. The package said what needed to be said. What it said, stripped of its legal scaffolding and its careful documentation, was this: the woman in the orange jumpsuit had been selected as a target because she was convenient. She had a name. She had an identification document. She had, at one critical moment, shared a living space with a person who understood that convenience and had used it. The selection had been cold and precise, and entirely without regard for what it would do to the actual life of the actual person whose name and document had been borrowed for a purpose she had never sanctioned. It had been the kind of harm that is easy to commit because it does not require the perpetrator to be in the same room as the person it destroys. It is done at a distance, through the infrastructure of institutions that will do the work of the destruction without being asked to understand what they are destroying. Mara had been put into the machine by someone who knew how the machine worked and had calculated correctly that the machine would process her without asking the questions that would reveal the error. The identity theft report was in the system. The date discrepancy was verifiable. The signature anomaly existed and was documentable. None of these things had been checked because the machine had no procedure for checking them in the absence of someone who knew to ask. Sylvia had known to ask. Sylvia had asked. And the answers had come back exactly as the 3 handwritten pages Mara had given her in their first meeting had predicted they would. Coyle read. He read with the focused stillness of someone for whom reading has become the primary activity, and all other activities have been suspended until it is complete. The courtroom waited. The gallery, which had come in anticipation of one kind of drama, found itself present at a considerably different kind. And the difference was not disappointing. It was the particular drama of watching something that was assembled incorrectly be taken apart and reassembled into its correct shape. When he finished, Coyle set the last page down. He looked at the prosecution table. The lead prosecutor, a man named Alan Greer, who was experienced enough to have understood, from approximately page 12 of the package where this was going, met the judge's eyes with the expression of someone who has been handed information that requires a response and is deciding what that response will be. "Mr. Greer," Coyle said, "has the prosecution reviewed this documentation?" "Not in its entirety. Your Honor, we received it this morning." "You will review it in its entirety," Coyle said. "I am granting a continuance of 21 days. During that period, the prosecution is directed to conduct an independent verification of the document examiner's findings and to review the identity theft report in relation to the storage unit registration." He paused. "The court is also directing a review of the warrant information contained on the final page of the defense's submission." He looked at Mara, and this time the look was different from the look with which he had begun the hearing. It was not warm. Coyle was not a warm man, but it was attentive in a way that the earlier look had not been. It was the look of someone who has been surprised into paying attention and is now paying it. "Miss Venn," he said, "bail is set at personal recognizance. You are to remain within the jurisdiction and surrender your passport." He picked up his pen. "You are released pending the continuance." He wrote something. He did not use the gavel, which in his courtroom was a gesture reserved for moments that required a period at the end of a sentence. He set the pen down and looked at the papers in front of him and did not look up again, which, in a different way, was also a statement. It said, "The proceeding continues." It said, "We are moving forward." It said, in the particular silent language of a man recalibrating in public, "Something in this room has changed, and the change is permanent, and we will proceed from here." Mara uncrossed her arms. She turned to Sylvia, who was already packing the folder with the organized efficiency of someone who had done the thing she came to do, and was now preparing for the next phase of doing it. They spoke briefly and quietly. Then Mara turned back to face the room, not the judge, not the attorneys, but the room itself, the full gallery of people who had come to watch something and had watched something, though not the thing they had expected. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved in the way that relief usually looks. She looked like someone who has been waiting for the truth to have enough room to stand up straight and has just watched it do so and is now simply present for what comes next. What nobody in that room knew yet was what came next. Not even Mara, entirely, though she had more of the shape of it than anyone else present. What came next was going to be longer and harder and more procedurally exhausting than the morning had been. What came next was going to require patience and precision, and the particular willingness to hold the truth without flinching even in the rooms that were not yet ready to receive it, but the room had moved. Rooms do that sometimes when the person standing in them refuses to be smaller than they are. They move, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but they move, and a room that has moved cannot go back to exactly where it was. The position is lost. The assumption is cracked. The shape that the proceeding was supposed to take has been permanently altered by a woman in orange who answered a question in a dead language because she actually knew the answer, and the knowing of it had changed the entire room's understanding of who it was dealing with, and that understanding, once arrived at, could not be unarrived. She had not planned the ubik. It had been asked for, and she had given it. That was the entire, unremarkable truth of what had happened. She knew the language because she had spent 2 years learning it. And she had spent 2 years learning it because she believed that every language that disappears from the world takes with it a way of understanding the world that cannot be reconstructed from outside. And she had believed this with enough conviction to go to Turkey twice and sit with elderly descendants of a people whose language had nearly vanished and record and study and reconstruct what remained. She had not known when she was doing that work that it would one day stand up in a courtroom and refuse to let her be defined by a story that was not hers. But it had. And that, she thought, as the bailiff indicated that she could step back, was something worth noting about the relationship between knowledge and survival. The knowledge you carry is not always the knowledge you think you will need, but it is always the knowledge you are. The 21 days of the continuance were not quiet days. Sylvia Park worked through most of them. She was the kind of attorney who approached a case the way a surgeon approaches a body, with complete attention, systematic methodology, and the understanding that the gap between what appears to be happening and what is actually happening is usually located exactly where nobody thought to look. She had taken Mara's case 3 weeks before the hearing because a colleague had sent her the file with a single line of context. Something is wrong here. Sylvia had read the file in 2 hours, identified 5 questions that the prosecution's case did not answer, and called Mara the same evening. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours. Mara had laid out everything she knew with the same precision she applied to linguistic analysis. beginning with the theft of her identification documents and moving forward chronologically through every subsequent event, including the storage unit she had learned of only through her arrest, including the roommate whose name she had not spoken in over a year, including the 2-week period between the roommate's departure and Mara's realization that several important documents had disappeared with her. She had not editorialized. She had not appealed for sympathy. She had simply presented the sequence of events as she knew them, with the gaps clearly identified as gaps, the inferences clearly identified as inferences, and the verified facts clearly identified as verified. Sylvia had listened to all of it. Then she had asked 4 questions. Mara had answered each one without hesitation. By the end of the conversation, Sylvia had a clear picture of what the case actually was, and she had begun to understand that what made it prosecutable was not evidence of guilt, but the absence of a challenge to the assumption of guilt. The chain of inference from stolen ID to storage unit registration to the materials inside it was clean only if no one tested it. Sylvia intended to test every link. She did not rush. Rushing produced errors, and errors in this kind of case did not merely fail to help the client. They could be used to cloud the clarity of the actual facts, which were already clear enough to carry the case if presented without noise. So she worked carefully, thoroughly, and in the correct sequence, building from the most easily verifiable facts outward toward the more complex ones, establishing a foundation that the prosecution could not dismiss without engaging with specific and documented details rather than general narrative probability. She was not rushing, but she was not resting either. The document examiner's findings were independently verified on day 9. The independent analysis, conducted by a specialist retained by neither side but appointed at the court's direction following Coyle's order, confirmed the defense examiner's conclusions with a slight expansion. The signature discrepancy was not only apparent in the storage unit registration, but also in 2 earlier documents in the facility's records that the facility manager had produced under subpoena, including an access log entry from 6 months after the initial registration. The individual who had been accessing the storage unit was consistently not Mara Venn, and the consistency was documentable. The identity theft report was cross-referenced with the storage unit registration on day 11. The match was exact. The ID number used to register the unit was the number of the document Mara had reported stolen. The incident report timestamp predated the registration timestamp by 31 days. The warrant review, which had been ordered almost as a procedural addendum, but which turned out to be the most consequential piece of Coyle's Day 9 directive, produced results on day 14. The individual named on the final page of Sylvia's package had not simply disappeared. She had been located by law enforcement in a 3rd city, operating under a partial identity modification that had been adequate to avoid casual detection, but not adequate to survive a targeted search informed by specific identifying information. She was arrested on the existing warrant. During the processing of her arrest, investigators found, among other items in her possession, a document bearing Mara's name that she had no legitimate reason to possess. Sylvia received the call about the arrest at 7 in the morning on day 15. She sat at her desk for a moment after the call ended and looked at the wall of her office with the specific expression of someone who has been working toward a result and is now receiving it, and finding that the receiving of it is more complicated than the working toward it had been. She had been certain from the beginning of what the truth was, but certainty and confirmation are different experiences, and the confirmation, when it arrived, carried with it the full weight of what the alternative would have meant. A young woman in an orange jumpsuit, convicted on the basis of documents that had been used without her knowledge to frame a version of her life that was entirely false, serving a sentence for something she had never done. She called Mara. The conversation was short, and by the standards of 3 weeks of intensive contact, unusually quiet. Mara said thank you in the steady voice she used for most things. Sylvia said it wasn't over yet, but it was close. Mara said she knew. Mara. They ended the call, and Sylvia began drafting the motion to dismiss. The motion was filed on day 17. It was 23 pages long and built with the structural elegance of an argument that does not need to be persuasive because it is simply accurate. It cited the independent document examination. It cited the identity theft report correlation. It cited the storage unit access log findings. It cited the arrest in the third city and the evidence recovered. It included a summary of the timeline that showed, in a single page of clean chronological notation, the complete sequence from stolen ID to registered storage unit, to accessed storage unit to arrest, with the name of the actual responsible party attached to each relevant point in the sequence. Greer read it the day it was filed. He was, to his credit, a thorough man. And thoroughness in this case meant that he could not maintain the prosecution's position without engaging with the specific technical details that the motion presented. And engaging with the specific technical details meant acknowledging that the case against Mara Venn had been built on an identification that was false, and acknowledging that meant the case no longer existed in any form that could be maintained. He sat with the motion for 2 hours before making any calls. This was unusual for him. He was not a man who typically required extended solitary time to process information. But this situation required something that professional processing alone could not supply. It required him to locate, somewhere in his working understanding of his own role, the line between the legitimate advocacy of a position that turned out to be wrong and the continuation of a prosecution that the evidence had revealed as foundationally false. He had believed the case. He had not invented it, and he had not manipulated the evidence that had come to him. He had received a set of materials that pointed clearly in one direction and had done his job in that direction with the professional thoroughness that his position required. The fact that the materials had been incomplete and that the incompleteness had been the direct result of an act of deliberate identity fraud committed against the defendant did not make him culpable in the way that actual misconduct is culpable. But it also did not make him a neutral party who had simply been mistaken. He had been in a position to ask more questions. He had not asked them. The file had looked complete because complete-looking files are what the machine produces when it processes a case, and Greer had trusted the machine because trusting the machine was how the machine kept functioning. Mara Venn had trusted a system that had handed her name to someone who used it as a tool, and Greer had trusted a system that had handed him an incomplete file and called it sufficient. Neither of them had known in advance that the trust was misplaced. But only one of them had been put in handcuffs for the consequences of the misplaced trust, and that asymmetry was something he would need to carry forward, carefully, into every subsequent file that came to him looking complete. He called Sylvia the following morning. The conversation was professional and brief and devoid of the kind of language that would need to be apologized for later. He indicated that the prosecution would not contest the motion. Sylvia thanked him for his time. The call ended. On day 20, the court entered an order dismissing all charges against Mara Venn with prejudice. The hearing was brief. Coyle read the order in the flat, precise language of judicial administration and asked if there were any objections. There were none. He signed the order, and it was done. Mara was in the university library when Sylvia called with the news. She was sitting at a carrel in the back of the 3rd floor where the phonology section was housed, working on a chapter of her dissertation that examined the sound system of a nearly extinct language spoken by fewer than 40 people in a mountainous region that she had visited twice and was planning to visit again. She was wearing her own clothes. She had been wearing her own clothes for 17 days since the personal recognizance release, and the wearing of them still registered as something, not dramatically, but in the small continuous way that recovered things register, the ordinary made briefly extraordinary by its absence. The library was the place she had returned to first, the morning after her release. Not her apartment, which she had entered and then left again within 20 minutes, finding it too quiet in the particular way that places become too quiet when you have been away from them in circumstances that redefine the relationship between yourself and ordinary spaces. The library had the right kind of quiet, the impersonal, ambient quiet of many people being thoughtful simultaneously. The quiet that asked nothing of her and offered the particular sanctuary of rooms organized entirely around the proposition that knowledge is worth the effort of accumulation. She had sat in that carrel for 3 hours that first morning and had not worked. She had simply sat and let the library be around her and let the 17 days begin to find their place in the long sequence of her life rather than standing at the front of it, blocking everything else. By the second morning, she was working again. She set down her pen when Sylvia's call came. She listened. She said thank you. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the third floor, which was a good quiet, the quiet of a room full of the accumulated knowledge of many people who had spent their lives trying to understand something precisely, and she let the news settle in her the way news settles when it confirms what you believed but could not fully count on. Then she picked up her pen and continued working on the chapter. She finished it 2 weeks later. It was a meticulous analysis of how a specific set of phonological features in the language she was studying encoded distinctions of social relationship that no other known language encoded in precisely the same way. Distinctions between levels of respect and familiarity, and the complex obligations of reciprocal recognition that existed between people in that community. The language, she argued, was not simply a system of communication. It was a system of ethical relationship. To speak it correctly was to enact, in the very act of speaking, a set of commitments about how you regarded the person you were speaking to. She thought, while writing it, about what it would have meant to someone in that linguistic community to be addressed in the wrong register. To have someone use the form of address that implied a relationship that did not exist. To be spoken to in a language that carried, embedded in its very grammar, a misreading of who you were. The disrespect in it would not have been incidental, it would have been structural. The language would have been wrong in the way that false testimony is wrong, not merely inaccurate, but a violation of the relationship between the speaker and the truth. She had been spoken to incorrectly. In a courtroom, in a language she knew well, she had been addressed as a thing instead of a person, processed as a summary instead of received as a human being. The grammar of that address had been the orange jumpsuit and the laughterless efficiency of the proceeding, and the question designed to expose rather than to understand. She had answered in a language that did not permit imprecision, and had, in doing so, forced the room to address her correctly. This was what language did. At its most essential, at the level below communication and above silence, this was what it did. It forced a reckoning with the reality of the person speaking it. You could ignore a summary, you could process a file, you could manage a procedure, but you could not hear Ubik spoken correctly in a fluorescent courtroom by a young woman in orange without understanding in some immediate and unignorable way that what you were hearing was a person and not a category. Her dissertation committee received the chapter and found it, in the words of the most reserved member of the committee, genuinely significant work. The full dissertation was defended 6 months later. The defense was long and rigorous, and at one point moved into a discussion of phonological reconstruction methodology so technically specific that 2 of the committee members asked Mara to slow down and explain a concept at greater length, which she did, without condescension and without simplification, finding the exact level of specificity that served the listener's understanding rather than the speaker's display. Afterward, in the hallway outside the defense room, Professor Reyes told her that the work was among the best she had overseen and that it would matter, not in the way that academic work sometimes matters, performatively, in citation counts and conference appearances, but in the actual preservation of something real, something that existed in the world and had a right to continue existing. Mara thanked her. She meant it in the full sense. Raymond Coyle did not attend any of this. He did not know that the woman whose case he had dismissed had defended a dissertation. He did not know about the phonology chapter or the committee's response or what Professor Reyes said in the hallway. He went on managing his courtroom and his docket and his 14-year accumulation of judicial habit. And the morning of Mara's hearing receded into the long sequence of mornings that a judge accumulates and that eventually begin to look, from a distance, more or less similar. But something in him had changed, and the change was specific enough that Davis, a court reporter who had worked in his courtroom for 6 of his 14 years, noticed it. The change was in the preparation. Coyle had always prepared thoroughly for complex commercial cases and political cases and the cases that attracted attention. He had prepared less thoroughly for the cases that did not attract attention, the cases that arrived in orange, the cases that arrived without private counsel or professional letters of support, the cases that arrived as summaries and were processed as summaries, because the summary was usually enough. He had prepared for Mara Venn's case as a summary. He had read the charge section and the financial assessment and the brief biographical notation that described her as a graduate student and had formed, and from those materials, a shape that he had carried into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had done this 14,000 times and trusted his pattern recognition. The shape had been wrong. Not wrong in the minor sense of missing a detail or miscounting a figure, but wrong in the fundamental sense of being a different shape entirely from the actual person it was supposed to describe. He had known this the moment she began to speak, not from the ubik itself, though the ubik was its most visible expression, from the way she answered his initial questions, the precision of the pause before her answer about her area of focus, the absence of the self-minimizing hedge that defendants in orange almost invariably produced in response to direct questions from the bench. The steadiness of her regard, all of it had been communicating in the language of a person's presence in a room, something that the summary had not contained and that he had failed to receive because he had already decided the summary was sufficient. He had asked the ubik question to diminish her. He had received in response a complete and precise demonstration that the summary was a shadow, and the person casting it was entirely different from the shadow's shape. He had known it instantly. The courtroom had known it. And the knowing had been permanent in the way that certain knowledge is permanent. Not comfortable, not welcome, but indelible. After Mara's case, he began reading the background sections of those files. Not the charge sections, which he had always read, but the background sections. Education, employment, prior history of involvement with the legal system, languages spoken, the small notations that described, in the flat language of bureaucratic form-filling, the actual dimensions of the person the file was about. He read them with the specific and unspectacular attention of a man who has learned once, at cost to his own composure, that a file is not a person, and that confusing the two produces results he would prefer not to reproduce. He did not announce this practice. He did not discuss it. He simply did it morning after morning, in the 30 minutes before court was called to order, reading the background sections of the files for the day, the way other judges read the charge sections, and in doing so he became, incrementally and without ceremony, a slightly different judge than he had been on the morning he asked a woman in orange to speak Ubik for the court. He had asked it to expose her. Instead, it had exposed him. Not publicly. Not in any way that would appear in a disciplinary record or a news article or a conversation between colleagues, but in the way that actual exposure happens, which is privately, in the moment when you understand that you have been seen doing something you would not choose to have done, and the person who has seen it is yourself. He had been seen doing something he would not choose to have done. He chose not to do it again. Mara returned to Turkey the following summer. She spent 8 weeks in the diaspora community where she had conducted her earlier fieldwork, continuing the documentation project that had been interrupted by the arrest and the subsequent proceedings. The work was the kind of work that does not look like much from the outside. Long hours sitting with elderly speakers, recording and re-recording and verifying and cross-referencing, building a phonological archive that was precise enough to be academically useful and accessible enough to be returned to the community in a form they could actually use. It was slow and painstaking and occasionally frustrating in the particular way that fieldwork is frustrating, when the thing you are trying to preserve keeps moving at the edges. She loved it completely. On her last evening before the return flight, she sat with an old man named Bekir, who was one of the 3 remaining people in the diaspora with substantial active Ubik memory. Not fluency exactly. The language had passed beyond fluency, but memory, the ability to produce and recognize sounds and sequences that no one else in the world could produce and recognize without years of academic preparation. They sat on his terrace, and she recorded him, and he talked about his grandmother who had spoken the language fully, who had told him stories in it when he was small, stories he could not now completely recall but could feel, in the way you feel something that was given to you before you had language for the feeling. He asked her why she did this work, why a young woman from far away cared so much about a language that had almost no living speakers. She thought about the question for a moment. Then she said, in the Ubik that she had spent 3 years learning and that she could now speak, imperfectly but genuinely, because she had done the work, because every language that disappears takes with it a way of seeing that cannot be recovered. And I believe in not letting things disappear if I can help it. Bekir listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something in response, and what he said was long and complex and contained sounds that she would spend 2 more years learning to reproduce with full precision. But the sense of it was clear to her, that there was a particular word in Ubuk for the act of remembering something that is almost gone. A word that meant something like the last light before dark, but applied to knowledge, to the final presence of a thing in the world before its absence became permanent. There was no equivalent in English, or in French, or Arabic, or any of the languages she had studied. The concept existed in Ubik and in Ubik alone, and it existed because the people who had made the language had needed a word for it, because they had lived close enough to loss, to require precise language for the experience of watching something irreplaceable approach its ending. She wrote the word down, she recorded it, she added it to the archive, she brought it home. Some things are worth the fight to keep. Some fights look from the outside like a woman in an orange jumpsuit standing with her arms crossed in a courtroom full of people who have already made up their minds. From the inside, they look like years of sitting in a library and 2 summers on a terrace in Turkey, and the slow accumulation of a knowledge that was never supposed to be useful in a court of law, but turned out, on one particular Thursday morning, to be the only thing standing between a life and the false version of it that someone else had tried to substitute. Carry your knowledge, all of it. You do not always know which part of it will be the part that saves you. Share this story, because somewhere right now there is someone who has been reduced to a summary, and the full truth of who they are is sitting just outside the room, waiting for someone to open the door and let it in.